I want to bring you this report of the Pastor's Solidarity Mission that I just led with pastors from across America, Canada, and the UK who came to Israel under the banner of Eagles Wings and the Israel Christian Nexus. As many of you know, my family and I were in Israel on October the 7th, that bloody day, that horrible day, the massacre of Jews took place, the largest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. We were there in the land that day. We were in the land for the first 5 days of the war. And as soon as we got back to the States, the same day we landed, I was in New York City and saw something that terrified me. Days later in New York City, I witnessed and bore witness to thousands demonstrating against Israel. That video that I shot has now gone on to have literally millions of views around the world. And so I wanted to, as quickly as I possibly could, I wanted to rally American pastors to get them back to Israel, to the front lines, so that humanity can begin to understand the existential crisis, not that Israel is in, but that we as a planet are in. So we had an incredible group that gathered. I'm so blessed by these amazing leaders who came together from all of these different areas. We landed in Israel. We were joined by a wonderful friend of ours, Mr. Isaac Shomoff from Los Angeles, California, one of the leaders of the Jewish community there. And just as we began our time there, we met with Fleur Hassan. Fleur has been deputy mayor of the city of Jerusalem and special envoy to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Israel. She has risen as one of the leading activist voices speaking out clarity on the global media stage. She's been on BBC and CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and all of the major news outlets. She spent a considerable amount of time with us, briefing us on the reality on the ground. From there, we went to the Western Wall just as sunset was coming in for the lighting of the Hanukkah. And we felt that that was an important statement, because when you really understand the message of Hanukkah, Hanukkah was all about standing strong in the face of opposition, in the face of oppression, in the face of tyranny, and understanding the spiritual battle that manifests in the physical battle. So we had a meaningful time there at the Western Wall. We engaged in conversation with many people who were present, and then we had an in-depth time of studying Torah with Rabbi David Furman, who met with us there at the wall. A beautiful time studying together with him and hearing from him his perspective as an Israeli rabbi, trying to make sense. How is it possible 1 generation after the Holocaust, with all the work that's been done, with all the work of Yad Vashem and Never Again and the Holocaust museums around the world, and yet here we are, just 75 years after the Holocaust, and again, Jew hatred spreading all around the world. The next day, we headed south to the Gaza border. And it was surreal because things are relatively peaceful in Jerusalem. You feel tension in the air, but you don't feel unsafe. There's no sense of imminent threat. But as we approached Gaza in our bus, you literally could begin to hear the booms of the rocket fire, of the bombs. And first they were in the distance, then they got closer and closer. Eventually you could literally feel them. You could physically feel the shattering of the bombs. They were quite close. And then we began to hear the gunfire, literally hear the machine gun fire happening. And we became so aware that we were literally at the front lines, whatever it was, maybe a half mile away or less from the actual fighting. We went to Kfar Aza, and Kfar Aza is one of the kibbutzes where the slaughter took place. And we walked in the middle of this neighborhood that just a few weeks prior had families, had young people starting their lives out, had mothers and children and grandparents. And we walked through these neighborhoods that now were burned. We saw bullet holes in all of the doorways. We saw places where the RPG rockets had gone through. We saw the burned out cars. We literally saw destruction with every step. And we bore witness to the evil that was perpetrated. And when you hear the calls for ceasefire, and then you look upon the carnage, and you realize the evil, to call for ceasefire when this is what has just happened when there was a ceasefire. You know, the inconvenient thing about history is that it tells a story of facts. If we want to look at the facts of the ceasefires that have taken place time after time after time since Israel has withdrawn in 2005, the story is every single time that Israel agrees to a ceasefire with Hamas, every time since 2005, Hamas has simply used that time of the ceasefire to get in more weapons and more sophisticated weapons from Iran, from those who enable them, and build up and plan for their next attack. This is demonstrated over and over and over again. And we saw with our eyes the reality of that destruction. And then we went to the home of Alon Shemriz. We stood on his front porch with his father. And Alon's father told us of how just days, weeks earlier, his son had been kidnapped, and that his son was being held hostage as we spoke by Hamas. And his father shared with us on the front porch of Alon's home their hopes, their prayers, their work, their efforts to see Alon brought home safe. We listened to his cries, we prayed, we stood in solidarity with him as we contemplated the reality, this incomparable suffering that this father was going through. It was thus heartbreaking 48 hours later, after we had just met with Alon's father, that it was announced that Alon was one of the 3 hostages mistakenly killed by the IDF in the midst of this battle. It was devastating, and I cannot imagine what that family is going through. We then went and met with the mayor of Sderot. We went into the operations room of the city, and we saw the footage on the security cameras. We saw the footage of the invasion of Hamas. We saw the footage of Hamas shooting a little 4-year-old girl and her father as they were running away from the car. Saw them gunned down on the security camera. Sderot has lived for 20 years under rocket attacks, constant rocket attacks from Gaza. How they were invaded that day and the loss of life. We pledged your support. We pledged your prayers. We pledged your finances. We pledged your action. While we were there, Yoav Gallant, the head of the Israeli Defense Forces, was scheduled for a meeting with the mayor and with the other leaders of the city. And providentially, we were there at exactly that same time. And so we were able to speak directly to Yoav Gallant, who's the head of the entire IDF, and express our absolute solidarity with the Jewish state as they continue their mission for the eradication of Hamas. We then went and met with the team from United Hatzalah. We saw their mobile response unit And we heard in particular from one of their volunteers who personally drove back and forth on October the 7th, drove back and forth in their ambulance, bringing over 200 people to safety. However, he also was so committed to the sanctity of life and the honoring even of the memory of the dead that he was picking up corpses and putting them in the back of the ambulance, even though he knew there was no hope of saving them. He would go back and forth so that their relatives could at least have the closure of having their bodies to be buried. This man was obviously in a state of extreme PTSD. It was obvious, it reminded me of what it must have been like coming out of Vietnam. He was completely shut down emotionally, but able to recount all of these trips that he took in and out of the war zone on October the 7th. Finishing our time with United Hatzalah, we returned to Jerusalem. As soon as we returned to Jerusalem, we were immediately met in our hotel by reporters who wanted to hear our story. In this email that you're getting or on the website are links to the stories that have already started running in the Jerusalem Post, in Media Line, and in other news outlets. We are being your voice, we are being your hands, we are being your trumpet, your shofar extended. We're only doing that through your support, through linking together in this effort. The next day, we started the morning off at Abraham's Bread. Abraham's Bread has always been important, but in the past it was, a feeding center for those in poverty, a feeding center for those who needed help. Now it is feeding the soldiers on the front lines, feeding up to 5,000 people a week, the soldiers on the very front lines. And Mimi took us through the whole process that they're going through, just repurposing Abraham's Bread and now getting the food, getting the supplies to both soldiers on the front line and first responders in the midst of the war. We were then met at the hotel by Ambassador Danny Danon. Ambassador Danon had been Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. He was one of the most effective, powerful spokespeople on behalf of Israel, lifted his voice for years at the UN, and now is a senior member of Likud, a part of Israel's government in the Knesset. Ambassador Danon heard that Eagle's Wings was coming and reached out to us. And he said, "We know who you are. We know your years of friendship. We want to come and thank you and brief you," as he met with our pastors and spent time answering our questions and really empowering us on our mission. Finally, we then headed over to the CBN studios to our dear friend Chris Mitchell, and Chris was able to interview our pastors. Chris has been at this every day since the war broke, and we're so grateful for our partnership with CBN and all that they do to inform the global body of Christ and keep us in touch with everything that's happening in Israel and around the world. That's the quick overview of what we did during our time. But I want to speak with you for a moment about what I saw. Number one, I saw the resilience of the Jewish people. I saw the absolute resilience, the steadfastness, the firm resolve of the Jewish people. They have faced terror before, hatred before, and there is something deep within the spirit of the Jewish people that will not back down from them being who they are and living out their lives as Jews in the light of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the covenant that God has made with them. The second thing that I saw is their absolute commitment to the eradication of Hamas. I heard, even from the most liberal, left-leaning Israelis, that the global community has had 20 years to figure out what to do with Gaza. You've had 20 years of Hamas being in control, rockets falling on Israel, horrible anti-Semitism being taught in the school system. None of the Arab countries have come and built anything peaceful in Gaza. The United Nations has not come and built anything peaceful in Gaza. The European Union has not come and built anything peaceful in Gaza. Israel gave over 20,000 Gazans work permits Over 20,000 were brought into Israel every day. Don't hear about that on the evening news. Every day brought in to try to add to their economy, to try to have some semblance of coexistence, at least with those that they could. But the global community did nothing. And now Gaza has become the world's largest terrorist training camp. And Israel has no choice but to do what must be done, and that is to eradicate Hamas. And they will not back down until every last vestige of Hamas within Gaza is done away with. You can't do away with global radicalized Islam, because as I found out, that exists in Times Square. That exists in Times Square. But Israel is committed to eradicating the infrastructure of Hamas within Gaza. And so, as I close, I would say to us, we are on the verge of an evil far greater than Hitler. A threat far greater than Nazism. Hitler was contained mostly within one geographic region, and Nazism revolved mostly around one charismatic leader, Adolf Hitler. Radicalized Islam, the lowest estimates, the followers of a radicalized Islam puts it at 50 to 100 million globally. That's the lowest estimates. And they're all around the world. So please understand, Israel is not at war. The world is at war. Israel is simply the front lines of that battle. And Hamas is being aided and abetted by the far left woke who have found their ways into the academic halls of our universities all across the West. This is the twisted, antithetical, ununderstandable, it makes absolutely no sense how the very most liberal, left-leaning minds could come into collusion with radicalized Islam. There's no universe in which that math makes sense. And yet here it is. That's the reality of what we face today. And so this video is my call, this video is my witness, and this video is your wake-up call.